Hi, I'm Steve Groves, head chef at Royal Parliament Square and National Chef of the Year winner. My style of cooking is very much based on French classics, but with a modern interpretation. And it's all about generosity, and I think with this Banquist hamper, we've really captured that. So we've got a starter of marinated tuna with pickled carrots, furikake and avocado. The main course is a lovely 21-day aged pork cutlet with some crushed Jerusalem artichokes, trompet mushrooms, hazelnuts and quince. And then for pudding, we've got a caramelised banana soufflé, miso mascarpone and crispy caramelised peanuts. And we've paired that with a fantastic Pinot Noir. At Banquist, we always send you amazing hampers with great ingredients. Here's what's in today's box. So for a starter, we've got some fantastic sashimi grade tuna, some coriander cress, some purple carrots with a nice bit of colour. We're going to pickle those with some ginger pickle, some furikake for a bit of spice, some lovely soy dressing, some crispy shallots for texture, some avocado. For the main course, we've got these fantastic pork chops which have been aged for 21 days, really tasty. Some brown chicken stock, some quince puree, some trompet mushrooms, Jerusalem artichokes, a really good seasonal ingredient, some chives, hazelnuts, thyme, some cider, a bit of garlic and some shallots for aromats. For the dessert, we've got a souffle base, so you can make your own souffle, some miso mascarpone, just gives a nice kind of salty kick, and some peanuts. So as always, we've provided you with some great ingredients. This is now just going to run through the bits that you need to bring along. So we've got some vegetable oil, some olive oil, some eggs, some butter, that's unsalted butter, some seasoning, so salt and pepper, and some sugar. In terms of equipment, you're going to need some cooking scales, a nice big mixing bowl, a sieve, 3 saucepans, a nice sharp knife, a whisk, a peeler, a frying pan, a couple of souffle ramekins, a couple of mixing bowls, a roasting dish, a cutting board, some plates for presenting on, some spoons, chef's best friend, and also some kitchen towels so you can just clean up as you go. So the first step, you want to do this about an hour before you start cooking, is to take the pork cutlets out of the fridge. So we want to get those up to room temperature so they cook through nice and evenly. Next job is to butter our souffle ramekins. We do this just so that the souffle rises nice and evenly out of the mould. If it sticks to the edges, then it's not going to rise nicely. We're just using some unsalted butter here. If it's not soft enough to brush onto the ramekins, you can just ping it in the microwave for 10 seconds at a time. Don't melt it, just nice and soft. And start at the bottom and brush all the way up. I was always taught that you have to brush in upward strokes, otherwise the souffle won't rise, and I've never been brave enough to test that theory, so just stick with it. And like I say, unsalted butter. If you did only have salted butter, that would be okay. It's, actually salt would work quite nicely with this dish, and salt can work quite nicely in desserts. I remember when I was on MasterChef, I did a chocolate ganache recipe. I'd asked the home economists for some unsalted butter. I think they tried to stitch me up and gave me salted butter. But actually, when it came to the judging, the main comment was how good the addition of the salt in the ganache was. So sometimes these things work out. Okay, so give that one coat. We're going to give these 2 coatings in total. So we're going to give it the first coating, pop them in the fridge, let that butter harden in the fridge, and then we'll give it the second coating, just a bit of double security when it comes to making our souffle rise. It's always the biggest fear when you make a souffle, is that it's not going to rise. So anything we can do to enhance our chances of it rising nicely are what we're going to do. So good double coating. Some people also line it with some sugar or cocoa powder, which you can do. I personally prefer not to. I'd like just the butter coating, and also make sure we get into this crease as well on these ramekins. Obviously you can do this in any ramekin. Some ramekins have just got straight sides, so you don't need to worry about that, but make sure you get a good coating and they're ready to go in the fridge to firm up. So for the next step, we're going to pickle our carrots. So we've got these amazing purple carrots. I think they're a great ingredient. They taste very similar to an orange carrot, but just in terms of the visual, they just look great. And I mean, you can get all sorts of different colours. You can get yellow ones, white ones. So we have done this dish at a restaurant before, using a kind of variety of different colours of carrots, which looks quite interesting on the plate. I like this just kind of nice purple look that you get from these. So to cook the carrots, I'm going to get a nice pan of boiling salted water. So I've just got a good amount of water in there and heavily season it with salt. We want that salt to be kind of really coming through so that it seasons the carrots lightly. It seems like a lot of salt to put in the water, but obviously it's diluted in there, and the carrots are not going to take on all of that salt. We do need to be a little bit mindful with the carrots as well, because they're going to go into this lovely pickle that I've made. That's kind of a little bit salty as well because it's got soy sauce in there. So this is made from a mixture of white soy, rice wine vinegar and a ginger pickle. So I made that by making a sugar syrup with equal parts of sugar and water, infusing lots of ginger root in there, blending it up so all the juices come out. So you've got a lovely heat from the ginger, some acidity from the rice wine vinegar and the sweetness from the syrup in there. It's just going to give our carrots a really lovely flavour that's going to complement the dish nicely. So with these carrots, we're just going to peel them, and you can see how amazingly purple that is inside. Just take the end off, and you've got this lovely kind of cross section. So we want nice thin slices, about a millimetre or so. If you've got a mandolin, then it's a good time to use it. Otherwise you can just slice them by hand. They're similar to beetroot in the sense that they do stain your hands a bit, so if you did have some gloves you could always wear those. So it's always something I think about once I've started doing it, and then think gloves would have been a good move on that. Okay, so the water's just coming to the boil. I'm just going to drop the carrots in, and because these are very thinly sliced, they're not going to take long to cook. And actually we want to keep a little bit of bite to them. We don't want them to be completely soft and mushy. And actually if they do cook too much and become really soft, then they tend to absorb a bit too much of the pickle and it becomes really intense. So we want to keep a little bit of bite to them, a little kind of slight crunch, and then they'll come straight out into our pickling liquor. So they're going to take about 30 seconds. Anywhere between 30 seconds and a minute. Any longer than that, we risk them becoming overcooked. So the best way to check these is actually just to take one and just try it. And they're perfect. They've still got a little bit of crunch to them, but they're not raw carrot. And just while they're still hot, just take them out of the water and into that pickling liquor. Try and let as much of the water run off as possible, just because we don't want to dilute the pickling liquor, but we want them to go from this water where they're nicely seasoned straight into the pickle. Where they're nice and hot and steamy, they tend to absorb that pickling liquor nicely. And this is going to be quite a quick pickle. They need to sit in here for, I'd say, at least an hour, but anywhere up to a few weeks is fine. So certainly something you can get ahead on. So we're going to move on to our sauce now, or our jus. It's going to be a very simple jus, but it's always good to do these things in advance, and we can just warm it up later. It just takes some of the stress out when you're actually coming to eat your meal. A Banquist is something that we like to kind of front load the prep jobs so that you can have a nice relaxing time when it comes to eating. So I'm going to start with a banana shallot, and this is just going to give us lovely depth of flavour, and this kind of jus method can be translated into lots of different flavours. You can change the flavour of the alcohol that's going in there. For example, I'm using cider. You could change that to wine or brandy or anything like that. Even whiskey I think works quite nicely with some things. You can also change the flavour of the stock, so you could use a pork stock, a lamb stock, a beef stock. We're going to use a nice kind of reduced chicken stock. I think it gives a nice meaty flavour without being too kind of overpowering. We don't want to lose the flavour of the pork in this dish. We just want to enhance those kind of meaty notes. So I've got a large banana shallot here. I'm actually just going to use half of it, and I'm going to slice that relatively thin. Don't worry too much about how this is sliced, because it is going to be strained out later on. Try not to fling it over the cooker. In my pan over here, just on the hob, getting nice and warm, I'm just going to add a little bit of unsalted butter, and just want to get that bubbling away before I add the shallot to that. And at this point I don't really want to get too much colour, because I want these shallots to start softening up, start to become slightly sweet before they start to caramelise. So we want it to be a relatively slow caramelisation initially. I'm going to add to that a bit of garlic. Again, it's just kind of building those kind of flavour foundations, and that is just crushed lightly. I'm going to season that with a little bit of salt. Now when making sauces, it's really important that we're careful with salt, because this sauce is going to be reduced down. The more it gets reduced, the more that salt intensifies. So I've just added a little bit of salt, which is going to help draw out some of the moisture from these shallots, and it would just help soften those up without colouring too much. It's very easy to add a lot of salt in the beginning, and then as you reduce it down to get the consistency right, you end up with something that becomes very, very salty. So to that now, I'm going to deglaze. You can see in the bottom of the pan you've got this almost kind of like brown fond, as we'd call it, and that's kind of that lovely flavours in there, which I'm now going to deglaze with some cider. So we want about 250 mils of cider. You want to use a dry cider. Anything too sweet will make the overall dish become a little bit too sweet. And once that's in there, I'm going to add some thyme, and I think thyme is a good addition to meat dishes. It works really well, just gives it that lovely kind of fragrance. And we're going to turn the heat up to high now, and we want to reduce that cider down. So the cider will get reduced down to almost nothing. It will clean up all the flavour off the bottom of the pan. Start to become slightly sticky, slightly sweet, and that will give us a nice bit of viscosity to the sauce, and a bit of kind of sweet and sour balance is kind of what we're looking for in that. And it's the same if you're adding wine. It's that kind of balance of sweet and sour that really complements the dish. This is a pre-made stock, but it's a really good quality pre-made stock, and I think it's important with sauces that are reduced that you use a proper stock that's been made from bones, because it will contain gelatin, which is what's going to give our sauce the body. So we've got a really good one here. This one's been reduced by half already, so it's already intensified the flavour a bit, and as that reduces down, that gelatin in there will give our sauce a nice coating consistency. We don't want anything that's too reduced and sticky and overly strong in flavour. We want something that just coats the meat lightly and just enhances that meaty flavour. So this is almost there. You can see the cider's reduced down a lot, and what you can actually, by looking at it, what you can normally see is that as things reduce down, as they start to become thicker, the bubbles become a little bit bigger in the pan. So it's a good way to tell that it's getting towards where we need to be. And also that listening for the sounds of it again, as it starts to sound a bit more frantic in there, we know that it's starting to reduce to the level we want it. If we don't reduce it enough, then the sauce will just become far too acidic. So as you can see, there's very little liquid left, and that's starting to become slightly syrupy. So we're ready to add our stock. All of that stock can go in. and then we bring that back up to the boil, and we want to reduce that probably by about 1/2 to 2/3, so that it just starts to take on this just lightly coating consistency. And the way we can check that is once we get there, we'll dip a spoon in, we'll see if it coats the back of a spoon. At the moment it's just literally running off. If you've got a very liquid sauce for a dish like this, it doesn't really coat the meat, it all becomes a little bit wishy-washy, and it doesn't really enhance that kind of meat flavour. So we'll reduce that, it'll probably take about 5 minutes or so. Okay, so I'll just turn the heat down now. We're pretty much where we want to be with this. And at this point, where we're cooking it ahead of time, it's always good to slightly under reduce it. But it's got this kind of lovely coating. We can see when you kind of push your finger through, it's just feels slightly sticky on your fingers, and then we're ready to go with that. And we're going to pour that through a sieve just to remove those shallots, the thyme and the garlic. And you can see it doesn't make masses of jus, but it's not like your Sunday roast gravy. This is obviously just thickened by reduction, so it's quite an intense flavoured sauce. And we'll actually reduce that a little bit further when we come to reheat it. If you reduce it too far before you pass it through a sieve, you can end up losing quite a lot of it, where it just sticks to the shallot and the sieve itself. So just cover that with cling film to stop it forming a skin, and that can be set aside until we need to plate our main course. So we're going to move on to preparing the accompaniments for the main course. So to go with the pork, we've got some lovely Jerusalem artichokes here. I think they're a real kind of seasonal treat, and likewise these incredible trompette mushrooms. So yeah, black trompette or trompette de l'amour, the black mushroom of death, or trumpet of death. The thing with these is they do have that kind of trumpet shape, whereby obviously they kind of grow on the forest floor, so you can get quite a lot of leaves and things like that inside. So they takes a little bit of careful cleaning. And then we've also got these hazelnuts. So we want to toast these off. So we're going to preheat our oven to 170 degrees, and then we'll just toast those off so they get that kind of beautiful kind of toasted nut flavour, which works really nicely with pork. Whilst the oven is preheating, I'm just going to prepare the mushrooms. So like I said, they do take a little bit of preparation. I'm just going to pull the bottom off, and then I want to pull the mushroom into kind of strips really. So we'll go through all of those. It's very important that we open these ones up and just check inside. You can not break them down into such small pieces if you wanted, but it's really important that you get inside and make sure anything that you don't want in there is out of there, because there's nothing worse than a gritty mushroom. This dish is based on the garnish that I did for National Chef of the Year final with my pork in that dish, so it's one that is very close to my heart. Any soggy ones, just get rid of them. Now in terms of washing them, some people say never wash mushrooms. I think it very much depends on the type of mushroom. These mushrooms definitely need a quick wash. I like to wash them 3 times in clean water. So you give them the first rinse, and these mushrooms tend to float, but any kind of grit or dirt that might be on the mushrooms will sink to the bottom. So just give them a quick rinse, agitate it slightly, and then it's important that you lift the mushrooms off of the top of the water as opposed to pouring the whole thing through a sieve, because if you do that, you'll just pour any grit or anything like that that's in there back over the top of the mushrooms. So do that once, change the water, give the bowl a rinse out to make sure there's no grit still in the bowl. Give them another rinse. We don't want to leave them sat in the water for any kind of length of time, because they will start to absorb the water and in doing so that will dilute the flavour of the mushroom. And then we need to make sure the mushrooms are nice and dry, because if we leave them really soggy when it comes to cooking them, what will happen is all that water will just kind of come pouring out in the pan and we'll end up boiling the mushrooms, and we want to roast these off nicely later. So what I do with these, and this is the only mushrooms that I would dry in this way because they are quite robust in terms of their structure, is just give them a good squeeze, let water comes out, and then they're relatively dry. Straight onto a paper towel and just let those finish drying off just to room temperature, just for kind of 10-15 minutes. When your oven's up to temperature, we're going to start to toast our hazelnuts. So just spread them onto a tray. You want them in a nice flat layer, and they're just going to go into the oven to toast for kind of 10 minutes. So to add some flavour to our trompet mushrooms, we're just going to cut up some shallot and garlic. So some finely diced shallot. And we just need a little bit, we don't need masses of shallot, so about a quarter. I've just taken this kind of petals of shallot to do this, and then just slice those into long strips or julienne, and then we're going to slice them across. This is the best way to get evenly sliced or diced shallot or onion. If you do it the traditional way, where you kind of just slice it to the root end, you do tend to end up with kind of varied sized and shaped pieces of shallot. This gives you a bit more of a uniform finish. It's up to you to decide how important that is to you. And whenever you're cooking, it's always good to get these little bits of what we call in the restaurant mise en place done. Little bits of preparation that just make things easier. And this is the same as we would do in a restaurant. It's about getting things prepared so that when we get to service time, everything's a lot smoother, a lot easier. Just gonna cut some garlic as well. I've got a small clove of garlic here. A nice trick actually for crushing garlic is to use the blunt side of the blade. Don't put your finger on top because that's the sharp edge now. And then just go across the garlic as if you're finely slicing it, and what this does is just crushes it. And then you can turn the knife back over and just chop across, and you end up with this nice finely chopped garlic, and it just saves you taking out the salt and crushing it to a paste on your board. So that's our shallot and garlic ready, our mushrooms are ready, and now we're going to move on to our Jerusalem artichokes. Jerusalem artichokes, we've got these lovely Jerusalem artichokes here. I think the flavour on these can be used in similar ways to potatoes, but they've just got a really, really lovely flavour. We're going to peel these. You can cook them with the skins on. I'd prefer for this method because we're going to crush them. I like it without the skin. So we're going to cut these up, not too small, because I want them to kind of cook fairly slowly. If we cut them to too thinner slices, they can become a little bit chewy, and then the insides don't really have the kind of fleshy texture which will make them nice to crush. So I'm going to cook those in a good amount of butter. What about somewhere between 30 and 50 grams of butter, and we just want to get that melted and just about starting to foam. Once we've got a good sizzle on that, we can pop our artichokes into there. And just turn the heat down to medium heat. Going to season those with a bit of salt. I'm just going to add a little bit of thyme to those just to give it a little bit of herbal flavour. And we want to cook these until they're really nice and soft. Now, they might take a little bit of water. If we need to add a little splash of water to stop them colouring as they're cooking, then we'll just add a little splash of water at a time. What I don't want to do is cover them with water and cook them so we dilute the flavour of the artichokes. We want the kind of flavour of the artichokes to intensify as they cook down and release their own liquid. This will take about 10 to 15 minutes just to cook until they're completely soft. And we'll just check them every now and then. Okay, so these are starting to just colour a little bit on the edges, so I'm just going to add a little splash of water, which will just stop that colouring. I want them to cook through before they start to take on any colour. But it's just a splash of water just to stop that, and you can see that almost kind of emulsifies with the butter. Just keep those cooking down, and we'll keep an eye on it as that water evaporates. If the artichokes are still not cooked, we might add another splash of water just until they're cooked through nicely and we can crush them. So hazelnuts are nicely roasted off now. They've had about 10 minutes in the oven and they smell fantastic now, and they're just where we want them. So artichokes are nice and soft now. There's still a little bit of bite to them, which is good, but what I'm going to do at this stage is just pour away some of that excess butter so that our artichokes are not going to be greasy. I'm just going to add another splash of water just to help finish those off. I'm going to increase the heat, and what I want here is for the remaining butter just to emulsify with that little splash of water that we've added, and then I can remove the thyme. That's done its job, and then we can just crush these artichokes. You want to keep some kind of slightly bigger pieces just to give a bit of texture, and then the other bits of thyme can come out. There's a few little bits in there, a few leaves, that's fine. And then you see you get this nice creamy crushed artichokes, and like I said, just leave some bits in there for texture. You just want some of it to kind of smash up to kind of pull the whole thing together. And then they are done. They will happily sit there for up to an hour, I'd say, and we can reheat those later on. We'll cover that with some cling film. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of preparation for the dessert now. We're going to do our crystallized peanuts. So we've got these lovely salted peanuts here, and then we've got some sugar and some water. So simple ingredients. We've got 80 grams of caster sugar, or granulated sugar is fine, and around about the same amount by weight of water. And we're going to just bring that to the boil so that forms a syrup, and then we'll add our nuts to that. So these just add a really lovely crunchy element to the dish, just to kind of break up that soft texture of the soufflé. We want it to be really nice and contrasting in that, and also the salt from this really enhances the dish. So once that comes to the boil, I'm just going to add the peanuts. And what we want now is for all this water to evaporate and the sugar just to coat the peanuts. And then once that happens, we'll just put it away from the heat. Keep stirring it until that sugar crystallizes and forms this nice powdery sugar coating. And there's more here than you need, but it's always good to do a few extra because they're quite moorish. And as we're making them in advance, you will be picking at them. And we want to cook it so the sugar just starts to caramelise, starts to take on some of those kind of bitter caramel notes, which will help cut the sweetness of the overall dish at the end. And you'll also notice the sound will change once the water's evaporated. This will start to become really quiet. You won't have this kind of vigorous bubbling sound. It will start to get quiet, so then we know that the water's evaporated and the sugars are about to start to caramelise. The volume of it is going down now, so I know that there's not much water left in there. So I need to just start to keep an eye on the sugars caramelising. Once the sugar starts to caramelise, I want to stir it so we get a nice even caramelisation. And also the nuts will start to toast. And you'll start to get that aroma coming at you as well, which is really nice. Okay, the sugar's caramelised. I'm just going to turn the heat off. And now just keep stirring until the sugar crystallises. A little bit of heat on that. You can do this over a kind of medium heat until they crystallise. Please crystallise.
What are people looking for when how do you know?
It will go all powdery. You literally see it, it's almost like magic. Okay, and the sugar just starts to become slightly powdery, and you lose that kind of control. You lose that kind of glossy coating to the nuts, and you end up with this lovely powdery coating, which will give you a fantastic texture over the top of the souffle. And it's always a massive relief when that happens, because sometimes it doesn't. So that's what we're looking for. We've got this lovely coating to nuts. Try not to touch them just yet because they're still hot, and actually they need to cool down completely before you eat them to get that really crunchy texture. It's quite a workout, that. So you probably burn off about 10% of the calories that you'll get from eating them. So allow those to cool down. And my top tip for this is give that pan a good soak in some water, and that will just help the sugar dissolve. Don't go at it with a scourer or anything like that. Just fill it with water, let the sugar dissolve, and that will clean really nicely. It's always a bit scary when you look at a pan coated in sugar. So for the starter, we're going to take our lovely sashimi grade tuna, and I really love raw tuna, raw mackerel, this kind of oily fish. I think it works really nice raw, and especially with the kind of Japanese flavours. So that's kind of where this dish was born from. It's a dish that we have on the restaurant menu for years, and it's evolved over the years to where it is now, and I really like it. So what we want to do with the tuna is just dice that into about ½ centimetre dice, maybe slightly bigger. We want a nice dice, but not too fine. I want some texture of the fish there. I don't want it to be lost by chopping it up too fine. And put that back in the bowl. I'm going to add to that some avocado, and this just adds looks like a creaminess to it, a richness to the dish. Just remove the stone. And then just cut that into quarters, and then I'll just remove the skin. Okay, and we're just going to cut this into a similar sort of size pieces as we've cut the tuna. We've got enough out of 3/4 of that. And now we're just going to season this. So I'm going to use some of this furikake which I've made. So this is just a mixture of nori seaweed, black and white sesame seeds, some dried chili, a little bit of salt and sugar. It's a traditional Japanese seasoning. It's quite often used to season rice, but I think it works really nicely with this. You get those lovely toasty flavours of the toasted seaweed and the seeds. You get a little bit of heat from the chili, which I think just works really, really well. Also going to use some of this soy dressing that I've made, which is a mixture of soy, rice wine vinegar and mirin. So the rice wine vinegar gives it a little bit of acidity, the mirin gives it a little bit of sweetness and a little bit of complexity of flavour, and the soy gives it that kind of saltiness. I've thickened it just slightly so that it coats the fish, just because otherwise it just tends to run out. Give that a good mix. And we want enough of that dressing so it just coats everything, but not so much that it would be pooling at the bottom. So you can see it's just coating really nicely. Important at this point just to have a quick taste to make sure that everything's seasoned properly. I mean, for me that's great. If you did want to add a little bit more salt, then you could, or you could add a little bit more of the dressing, but for me that is good. And we're just going to pop that just off centre on our plate, and I don't like to use a mould for this. I like to keep it a little bit freestyle, a little bit more natural looking. Okay, and then we're going to take our pickled carrots from earlier, just going to drain those on a piece of kitchen paper. And the reason for draining on the kitchen paper is you don't want all of that pickling liquor to start running all over the plate. It will start to look a mess. We've got some of our crispy shallots, so we're just going to sprinkle on these, add as well as a really lovely flavour, just a nice crunchy texture, a bit of a surprise in there. So just make sure these are nicely dried, and then it's just a case of arranging these over the top so we can seal all these bits underneath. Okay, and cover the other one. Okay, just use a little bit of kitchen paper just to clean up any drips of that pickle. Just take a bit more of our furikake and just season over the top and just let some of that fall around the plate as well. Few bits of this coriander cress, which just adds a really lovely freshness and also just breaks up that purple colour. They're quite powerful, these micro herbs, so a little goes a long way. So there we have it. It's marinated tuna with furikake, pickled carrots and avocado. I've paired this menu with this Jean-Claude Boisset Pinot Noir. I think it works really nicely with the dishes because it's a red, but it's nice and light. It's got kind of peppery notes which really pick up the heat from the marinated tuna really nicely. The fruity flavours in there, kind of you got raspberry, lots of kind of juicy berry flavours which I think work really well with the quince in the main course. And it's just really kind of fresh, fragrant. So we've had our starter. I hope you've enjoyed that. We're going to move on to the main course now. So the bits of prep that we've got ready to go, we've already got our artichokes crushed. They just need to be finished off. We've got our sauce that we made earlier. We've got our trompe mushrooms, which are nice and clean and dry. We've got our shallot and garlic that's going to go with that as well. And then we've also got our hazelnuts toasted off. So we're in a good place in the starter. We need to now turn our attention to the meat. We've still got our oven preheated at 170 degrees, which is what we're going to need for this. But to start with this meat, I'm just going to score the fat across just to help render some of that fat out and just make this bit nice and crispy. Now, the fat on this, where this pork is aged for 21 days, the flavour on the fat is really, really special. So we want to keep as much of that as possible, and like I say, if we can make it nice and crispy, then it's a lovely thing to eat. So just scoring in, I'm not going into the meat, I'm just cutting across that fat. And then I've got my frying pan on the stove, but it's not on, so we're going to put these into a cold pan and then turn the heat on. There's not many things I would do that with, but this just helps that rendering process. Now I'm just going to season this. I'm going to season it quite generously. It's quite a big piece of meat, so we want to get a good amount of salt over that. Some will go onto the plate, which is great because we can just kind of dab some of that salt up with the fat, because we want to get some salt on that as well. And just a bit of pepper as well. I like a bit of black pepper. So I'm going to put these fat side down into the pan, like I said, cold pan, put the heat on. If the pork does start to fall about a little bit, good trick is just to use a pair of tongs just to clamp those together if you've got some. And I'm going to put that on a medium to high heat, so I just want that fat to render out. It's in a dry pan, we want the pork fat to render out, and that's what's going to be our cooking fat for these. It's really important to take your time and get good colour all over this, because this caramelisation stage is what really kind of enhances the flavour of the meat. We can see already that fat rendering out, but we want to get a lovely colour on that outside and get it nice and crispy. So we've got a lovely colour on this part of the fat, but we just want to move that around so that we get it onto the other end. Obviously it's curved, so just have to move it around a bit. So now we've got some colour on the fat. Just want to get some caramelisation on the meat itself now as well. So the idea of roasting it in the pan first is to get that really deep caramelisation on the meat, which is what really builds up the flavour, and then it just goes in the oven just to finish it off, just to cook it through nice and evenly. When I'm caramelising it on the meat, just going to turn it over fairly regularly so we don't overcook it on one side. We want it to cook nice and evenly through, so just get a really deep caramelisation on that before it goes in the oven. Just try and get as much contact with the surface of the pan as possible, so it's all caramelising. And things will get a little bit smoky while you're doing this. There's not really any way around that. We need that hot searing. I'm just going to pop those into our roasting dish. To that fat, I've just taken off the heat for now. I'm just going to add a good knob of butter to that. I'm going to add a couple of garlic cloves, which I won't crush on there, just lightly crushed. And a bit of thyme in there as well. Just be careful, that thyme will start to splutter, but that butter really helps just take on the flavour of the garlic and thyme. And we just get that foaming. Just pop the pork back in there for a second. Just turn it over in the butter. Put those back in our roasting dish, and what I want to do is just put this thyme and garlic on the bottom. And just almost use the garlic and thyme to just kind of prop the meat up so that the main part of the meat isn't lying directly on the pan, and that will just help us get a nice even cooking to the pork chops. Pour that butter and fat over the top. And then that goes in the oven for, I'd say, 4 to 5 minutes. So whilst the pork is in the oven, we're just going to give our soufflé ramekins a second coating of butter. That first coating is set nicely onto the ramekin, which just allows us to put a second coating over the top. Just remember to brush from the bottom up. And again, just make sure we get into that crease around the edge. Okay, and they go back in the fridge and they're ready to be filled. So our pork is out of the oven now, that's just cooked through. It's really important that we give it a nice rest now. So we want to rest that for at least kind of 6, 7 or 10 minutes really. We can just kind of forget about that. Whenever you roast meat, it tightens up. So you just want those juices to flow back through the meat. It will all become a lot more tender and delicious to eat. So just a good rest. It can sit there in the tray that we cooked in. No problem at all. So while the pork's resting, we'll get ready for the rest of the garnish. So we're going to cook our trompette mushrooms, which we prepared and cleaned earlier. I'm going to cook those in the frying pan that I seared the pork in. And you don't need to wash this pan actually. Some of the flavours from the pork in there will actually really benefit the mushrooms. So I'm just going to add to the pan a good dollop of butter, probably about 20 grams. And we want to get that so it just starts to foam. We want a kind of nutty brown butter. Whilst we're doing that, we're going to warm up our quince puree. So this is a quince puree I've already made. So it's just quince cooked down with a little bit of orange juice, some lemon juice, a bit of sugar, and just blended to a nice smooth puree. And we can warm that up in some just hot water from the tap, because if it gets too hot, then it's going to squirt all over the place when we open the bag. So just want that warmed through. Doesn't need to be incredibly hot. And what that brings to the dish is just a really lovely sweetness. Now to the pan, I'm going to add the shallot and garlic that we chopped earlier. Just let those cook lightly. Just being careful we don't burn the garlic at this point. And I don't mind a little bit of bite in the shallots as well within this. I think it adds nice freshness. So the mushrooms go in. The mushrooms will wilt down, so I'm going to season them, but quite lightly. A bit of salt and pepper. And just let those mushrooms coated in the butter. Those until they soften slightly. You'll see a little bit of water coming out of the mushrooms when they go in. So turn the heat up and we want to cook that water away so that all evaporates and we intensify the flavour of the mushrooms, and then they'll really start to sizzle again. I'm going to take a few of our toasted hazelnuts and I'm just going to crush them lightly, just using the side of my knife blade. I don't want to break them too small, I don't want them to become a paste or anything like that. Now when my mushrooms start to sizzle again, and I can hear them sizzling, that's because all that water's evaporated that's come out of the mushrooms. And at this point I put my hazelnuts in there. Just stir those through. And that part of the garnish is now finished. So just turn the heat off. And it's important just to have a taste again, just to check seasoning. It's the most important thing you can do while you're cooking is tasting. Just to make sure things are where you want them. They're good for me. I'm happy with that. So that's ready, and now it's just a case of warming through the rest of our garnishes. To the sauce, what I will add is some of this kind of butter, and more so even the sediment at the bottom of it. I'm just going to add some of that to our sauce, so it just don't waste any of that pork flavour. And we're going to warm that up. We want to reboil the sauce. We'll warm up the artichokes, and to those I'm just going to chop some chives and add the chives, which will add a really lovely fresh kind of onion flavour. What about a tablespoon of chopped chives? That through. And we just finished reducing the sauce again, just until it's exactly where we want it. So whilst everything's heating up, just pop your plates into the oven just for a couple of minutes just to warm them up. You want to serve on nice hot plates, keep everything nice and hot. So everything's ready now, we're good to plate up, so we're going to start that. Now there is a prize for whoever creates the best plating arrangement, so if you feel that you can do it better than me and improve on my things, then do tag us at Banquist and at Steve Grove Chef, because we'd love to see how you plate this up at home. So there's a prize for a Banquist for 2, which is a fantastic prize. So I'll just cut the tip off of my quince puree. I'm just going to add a bit of that onto the plate and just let it kind of pull out a little bit. I'm just going to add a little bit more in there as well, because this just really gives it a little bit of sweetness to the dish, which I think works brilliantly with pork. It's the same way that obviously an apple puree or an apple sauce works really well with pork. We know that works. Quince just adds a kind of slight bit more interest in terms of flavour. And then we're going to add our crushed artichokes. So I'm just going to put a nice mound of that. And then we've got these fantastic pork cutlets. Got our hazelnuts and trumpet mushrooms. And then with our sauce, a little bit on the pork itself, and then just allow some of that to flow through that garnish so it kind of mixes with that lovely puree. So there's my roasted 21-day aged pork cutlet with Jerusalem artichokes, trumpet mushrooms and hazelnuts. So we're going to move on to the souffle now. For this, we've got our base here. So we've got 140 grams of our souffle base. This has been pre-made with a banana puree. So we use overripe bananas to make this lovely puree, and then cook that out with some caramel. So you got this lovely caramelized banana flavour. To make it rise, we need to make a meringue. So for that, I've got some sugar. So I've got 30 grams of sugar here, and I need 80 grams of egg white. So I'm just going to weigh our 80 grams. You can use pasteurised egg whites when you make souffles, or you can use nice fresh ones. So just want to take the whites, leave the yolks behind. It's really important with a meringue that you don't get any traces of fat into the whites. So make sure your bowl is nice and clean, there's no fat in there, and also make sure you don't get any of the egg yolk in there because that contains fat also. So just separate those. So just give those a quick whisk. I'm just going to add a pinch of the sugar to start with. And I want to start incorporating air now. So I'm just doing it in a lifting and kind of flopping down motion with the whisk. So rather than just back and forth, try and lift the egg whites so they really try to capture some air. And just keep that whisking. Once we get to nice soft peaks, then we'll start adding some more of the sugar, and that will help with volume and to give the meringue its structure. Okay, it's starting to whip up now. We've got our soft peaks, so I'm going to start to gradually add some of the sugar. So I'll add about a third of the sugar. Continue to whisk until that's mixed in. Another third. And then we add the last bit of sugar. And we're looking for stiff peaks now. So this meringue wants to hold its shape. It should be nice and glossy. And this is what will give our soufflé its rise and some structure. And you can of course do this in an electric mixer, especially if you're a bit tired from all that peanut exercise earlier. Okay, so we're getting nice stiff peaks now. I'm just going to give it a little bit more. And the true test is you should be able to hold it over your head, right? I always find it's better to check over someone else's head. So. Yeah, we're good. So now I want to add about a third of the meringue into my base and just beat that. I'm not worried at this point about knocking air out of the meringue. It's just about slackening that base so that we can incorporate the rest of the meringue without knocking out the air. So this first bit is just to loosen that base. And then the rest of the meringue can go in. Make sure we get all of it. And at this point I'm just going to turn the mixture over on itself so that we're not knocking the air out of that meringue, we're just incorporating it in. We don't want to over mix it because we don't want to knock the air out, but at the same time you don't want to under mix it where you end up with a streaky mixture that's got just meringue streaks through it without the banana flavour. Okay, so we've got a nice fluffy mixture. That's good. So now it's time to fill our ramekins. The butter's set nice and hard so they won't come off into the mixture. I'm going to use a piping bag just to fill them. It's a little bit easier to fill the moulds without any air pockets. So just scoop all of that mixture into the piping bag. And a good way to fill the piping bag is if you just fold it over your hand. Gives you a good amount of control when you're trying to fill it. I've seen a lot of people struggling with chasing a piping bag all over the place when they're trying to fill it out. And when we cut the tip off of the bag, we want to make the hole or the opening really quite big because we don't want to force all this mixture through a tight opening on the piping bag. because it will just knock out air. And then when we come to fill it, pop the tip of the bag right to the base of the ramekin, give it a slight squeeze so that mixture comes out right to the edges. Keeping the tip submerged, just gently squeezing as I kind of lift the bag up. And then we fill the ramekin. That stops any kind of air pockets on the sides of the ramekin. All the way up, slightly overfill the ramekins. And then taking a spatula or palette knife, just spread that mixture out to the edges. A lovely flat surface. Now just using your finger, just run around the edge just to make sure that the edge of the ramekin is clean so we don't burn anything on. And then also on the lip of the ramekin, where it kind of curves over at the top, if you just flatten something off, you end up with a very thin layer of the soufflé base right around the edge. And if that sets and sticks to the edge of the ramekin, then it's going to rise unevenly. So just using the tip of your thumb, just run around the edge just to release that, and that will help it rise nice and straight. Same with the other one, just run around, don't go too deep in with your thumb. And they are ready for the oven. So I always find it easier to pop them in a baking dish. We're going to put those into the oven for 5 minutes, and then we're going to turn them round, and that's going to give them a nice even rise, because the souffle doesn't have to be the most huge risen thing. It just wants to rise nice and evenly and neatly and lightweight. So with our crunchy peanuts, they've cooled down, they're really nice and crunchy and sweet now. I'm just going to take a few of them and just roughly chop over with a knife, just so they're not all whole pieces. You've got kind of varying sizes and texture, and this just creates a nice crumb to go over the top. So I've just turned the souffle around, set the timer for another 4 minutes, and then we're good to go. So I gave the souffle an extra minute just to make sure it's perfectly risen. I'm happy with that. And I'm now going to top that with some of our miso mascarpone. So this is just mascarpone, which just adds a really kind of rich creaminess, flavoured with some miso. So it's got a really nice, interesting flavour, slightly salty. It's also got some vanilla in there and icing sugar. So this really nice kind of sweet, salty cream. And I'm just going to let that nestle into the souffle, into that hole I just made. And then we'll just top that with some of these crunchy peanuts. And that is our finished dish. So it's caramelised banana souffle with miso mascarpone and peanuts.